Was John the Baptist a person of joy? Well, we can't really know, but there had to be something compelling about his ministry that drew people to him. Was Jesus a person of joy? I would guess yes. No matter how dry or stern we might make him, we have to remember that people wanted to be near him. And what was the source of joy? Too often we're told that joy comes from an absence of bad things. That joy happens when everything is going well, perhaps when the world is our friend and all seems to be going our way. But John the Baptist points us to a different understanding. John confesses who he isn't and receives God's invitation to be about the work of preparing the way. Someone I read this week said he was reminded of the confession that someone dealing with addiction has to make before the healing process can begin. Hey, I'm not God. And that simple realization is the first step to finding a new kind of wholeness. It may seem a simple thing, but how often do we play God in our own lives, in the lives of others, in the life of the church? How often do we make lofty claims about ourselves and our role as God's people? If we are honest, is not one of the complaints about the church and Christians that they are moralistic and tell others how they ought to behave? Are we not known as people who point out flaws and judge, people who love to play God? Hey, we're not God. What an affirmation. Secondly, we're not expected to be God. We're not asked to play God in our own lives or in the world around us. Is there not something freeing in that affirmation? John the Baptist didn't have to build himself up. He knew who he wasn't. And that knowledge freed him to do God's work. His work flowed from the freedom of not having to be God. He could testify. He could bear witness to God's presence. He could prepare the way. That is, he could help make those around him ready to see the light of God's presence in Jesus and hear his good news. Lutheran scholars I sometimes listen to said we need to remember that Advent is not merely about our own preparation. In fact, they suggest it is the world that should be our focus. How do we prepare the way for God to break into the rough places, the shadowed valleys, the airless mountains in ways that bring peace, wholeness, justice, and mercy? How do we make the world ready to receive God's continuing in-breaking presence? I think they were wise to remind us that this season cannot be one that focuses only on ourselves. But as we encounter John again, we have to stop and reflect that his preparation was possible only because he himself had prepared God's way within himself. He could see the light because he knew he himself was not the light. Joy comes not from an absence of responsibility, but from the amazement that God calls us, even as we are, to be witnesses, to testify, to prepare in our own hearts and in the world for God's redeeming presence. Joy comes not from lofty positions, but from the awe that honestly says, I am not the Messiah. I am not Elijah. I am not the prophet. Yet God calls me to be a part of this marvelous work. The Christian church at its best has focused not on its own health, its own well-being or position, but on the joy of being called to do God's work. And the church has accomplished many things through the centuries. Think of the hospitals and medical clinics that prepare God's way by ministering to the physical and emotional needs. Think of the schools that have challenged young and old to explore God's world. The church has fed people, clothed people. One recent story that stayed with me is that of Christian churches coming together to rebuild mosques. It was a profound witness that healed wounds. The Christian church has helped topple institutions and even governments of oppressed people. It has done so most effectively when it has borne witness to the love and light of God and invited people into that light. And to be honest, that task is usually difficult. And it is truly only possible when it is grounded in the love, mercy, and call of God. It is truly only possible when the church claims its joy not in itself, but in God's continued presence. It would be easy to dismiss John the Baptist as an odd character, but a necessary one who prepared Jesus' way. But let's not dismiss him. Let's learn from him. We learn the freeing affirmation that we are not people of position, privilege, or power. We ourselves are not God. We don't have to be. That is our joy. That God calls us, even us, to testify, to witness, and I always like this little phrase, with words if necessary, to witness to God's loving, redeeming presence. Alexander Shia suggests that this morning's gospel lesson be rewritten. There is one sent from God whose name is, put in your own name. I come as a living witness, proclaiming radiance in darkness, so that all might believe through the example of my life, attitudes, and practice. This is the witness I give when the old temple authorities send representatives to ask, "Who are you?" I confess and I do not deny. I am not the Messiah, the Christ, the breath of God. So they ask, "What then? Are you Elijah?" I'm not. "Are you the prophet?" No. Then they say to me, "Who are you?" Let us have an answer for the old temple authorities who sent us. What do you say about yourself? I say, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of God's breath, as the prophet Isaiah says. Now they were sent from yesterday's understanding, and they ask, why then are you baptizing? Suddenly then we are John the Baptist. The work of Advent, the joy of Advent, is the current event to which we are invited for our own sake and for the sake of God's beloved world. I think that song, "We Need a Little Christmas," might have it right when we put it in its context. For it is a song about finding joy in the midst of difficult times. It's not a song about abundance. It's a song about faith and hope and joy, even when all seems to be falling apart. That's the invitation extended to us, to find the joy of God's invitation to each of us, to all of us, to bear witness in this world to the light that continues to shine. We will join together in the hymn, "What Child Is There?"